Greetings and welcome. You're tuned into TMH's Daily English News. Moving on to our headlines for today, the ICG says Eritrea's leader remains the single biggest obstacle in forming peace in Ethiopia. Documentary exposes the dehumanization of the blockade that's currently on Tigray. And European Council President urges Ethiopian Premier to sustain improvement of humanitarian access into the Tigray region. As we move on to our main updates, our first update begins with ICG's perspective as to why this Ethiopian conflict is still ongoing and another country's leader seems to be the biggest hurdle to what peace seems far. International Crisis Group says Eritrea's leader, Isaias Afwerki, remains the single best obstacle to fledgling peace efforts by federal and Tigrayan authorities. The ICG, in an article titled "At Long Last, Ethiopia Prepares for Peace Talks," wrote the Ethiopia's federal and Tigray regional governments are finally gearing up for direct negotiations, but it noted that Eritrea's government and its longtime leader, Isaias Afwerki, would probably be the single biggest obstacle to the fledgling efforts by the federal and Tigray authorities to bury the hatchet. Any further federal steps towards peace with Tigrayan forces risk triggering a very spoiler response from Asmara. Eritrea, whose army has alongside federal troops and Amhara forces, waged war upon Tigray's forces would not be represented in the envisioned talks, which the TPLF and Isaias have been at odds since at least the 1990s, and the Eritrean president saw this Tigrayan war as an unmissable opportunity to deliver his archenemy his final fatal blow. The ICG says while the Eritrean leader's military inflicted severe damage in the Tigray region, including, according to Ethiopia's Attorney General, atrocities against the civilians, the Tigray forces have yielded little of their power, having amassed a formidable fighting force that poses an existential threat to Isaias himself. And Abiy's pivot towards peace is thus a major headache for Eritrea's leader, but it is unclear on how that leader might respond after this negotiation. And aside from skirmishes on Tigray and Eritrea border back in May, there have been no clear indication that Isaias will in fact try to ruin these talks, or even that he has the capacity to do so, as well as ICG alluded to. Moving on to our next update, the UK says the ongoing and desperate humanitarian situation in Tigray must be addressed as an absolute priority. Members of the UK's House of Lords also voiced strong opposition to the Ethiopian government's and deliberate starvation of the people of Tigray as well. The UK delivered a statement yesterday during the interview dialogue with the International Commission of Human Rights experts on Ethiopia. While the UK strongly welcomed the cessation of hostilities between the government in Ethiopia and Tigray, the forces stressed that the situation on the ground remains dire for those caught up within this conflict. We urge all the parties to ensure unfettered humanitarian access to Tigray and immediately restore services to the conflict-affected regions, as the statement added. The UK also pointed out that the political solutions is the only way to protect the unity of Ethiopia, avoid a descent back into the conflict and chaos, and to prevent further deaths as well as destructions of lives and livelihoods. In related news, UK members of the Parliament, Margaret Wheeler, highlighted that the worrying reports of displaced people in Tigray continue to eat wild plants just to merely survive. Let's take a listen.
Despite the welcome increase in supply, there are continued reports in some parts of Tigray that internally displaced people are still resorting to eating wild plants to survive. What steps are the government taking to end the continued humanitarian blockade and ensure that aid is received in all parts of Tigray?
Margaret wasn't the only one who spoke up during the talks. Lord Singh of Wimbledon on the occasion lambasted Eritrea's role in maiming and killing people in Tigray and called for an end to arms sales to the country as well. Let's take a listen.
My lords, would the noble Lord the Minister agree that our selling arms to neighbouring Eritrea, a country with a dismal human rights record and an active participant in the maiming and killing in Tigray, is not exactly helping towards a peaceful resolution?
The UK government has urged the international community of human rights experts on Ethiopia to work towards ensuring justice for the victims of human rights violations and abuses and that the perpetrators are held accountable without impunity, and which is the viral part of this process. A new documentary exposes the dehumanization that this current blockade has imposed on the Tigray region. The documentary, produced by a European-based media outlet and broadcast in various languages, showed how the blockade is leading many, including children and the elderly, to slow and painful death. Famine kills the youngest children indiscriminately, and first, says the producer of the documentary, is showing the footage of severely malnourished children in the hospital beds, desperately groaning from pain due to the lack of therapeutic feeding and medicine. In the absence of food, children are seen eating wild fruits, and the elderly on deathbed relying on just holy water. Let's take a listen.
The people here where they are gathering are The people here where they are gathering are taking holy waters. As you know that the federal government with the Eritrean troops as they blockade the humanitarian aid accesses, that the people have nothing to eat. So they are trying at least they are just drinking the holy water to fill their stomachs.
The documentary indicates how people in what was once the bustling city of Ma'ala, the regional capital, have resorted to horse-drawn carriages for transportation due to unheard of fuel prices, and a full tank of gas is negotiated in the city at about $700. At this price, the Tigrayans remain rooted to the spot, as the documentary says, talking of the impact of the blockade enforced by the Ethiopian government and their Eritrean allies. In the countryside, these forces have destroyed, burned, and everything during the war, crops, beehives, and other belongings of these Tigrayan civilians. And according to the documentary, the Ethiopian Prime Minister designated the Tigray region as the region to make sure to destroy. Lord David Alton, in a comment during yesterday's session at the UK House of Lords, brought the attention of the members' house to the grim reality conveyed by this documentary. Let's take a listen.
My Lords, has the Noble Lord had a chance to look at the link which I sent him over the weekend of a French documentary, the first in 18 months, to be undertaken by international independent journalists who had access to Tigray, entitled Tigray, the Land of Hunger? And it develops a point made by the Noble Baroness Lady Wheeler. It's about the deliberate starvation of the people of Tigray, which, my Lords, is a war crime. Does the Noble Lord agree that with 6 million people under siege, starving to death, a situation that will only be worsened by the blockades in Ukraine, that Tigray is without electricity, internet, banking services and medical supplies, and the situation for them is dire? When will the FCDO Jack's report, the review of joint analysis and conflict stability in Ethiopia, be completed? And are we preserving the evidence so that those responsible for atrocity crimes will be brought to justice? Does he agree that there can be no peace without justice?
Remaining within the European Council President Charles Michel urges Ethiopian Prime Minister to sustain an improvement on humanitarian access to the Tigray region. Bernard Late, spokesperson for the European Council President, said Charles Michel spoke on the phone with Prime Minister of Ethiopia Abiy Ahmed to follow up on their meeting in the margins of the AU-EU summit and on the recent visit of the Commissioner of Lenarsic to the country as well. He notably called for the use of the alternative roads to boost humanitarian access and the restoration of basic services, notably telecommunication, and the president also highlighted that the fuel and fertilizers are urgently needed to fight food insecurity as well. The president encouraged the prime minister to engage in inclusive peace talks as soon as possible, and also echoed that the EU's hope for a positive outcome of this process, given the strategic importance of Ethiopia for the stability of the region, is vital. Our final update for today: a survivor shares an extremely harrowing account of the Aksum massacre by the Eritrean forces that took place in November of 2020. Hiyab Gabratzadik, who was the assistant professor of tourism management at Aksum University in Tigray before the war, shared his account published on Tekhat under the title Eyewitnesses Account of Massacres of Aksum and its Vicinity. The eyewitness said the invading Eritrean forces started their attack by shelling the city of Aksum and its surroundings with artillery in afternoon on November 19th of 2020. The random shelling killed many people, including a mother and her 2 children who had come home from Humera to escape the war. This was followed by a rampage of killings, which in 3 days saw the butchering of around 1,100 people, mostly around the church of Mariam Tseon, and this is excluding the number of farmers murdered in the nearby villages and the St. Michael neighborhood as well. The eyewitnesses said 4 of its colleagues at the Aksum University were killed. Ethiopian soldiers continued the massacre after Eritrean soldiers left for some weeks later, and the troops were looting government offices, pharmacies, hospitals, clinics, businesses, shops, hotels, banks, and ATMs, as well as the list goes on. They took away medicines, generators, cars, gold, electronics, cash, merely anything they can get their hands on. And he said that the vultures, crows, and devour the bodies by day and the hyenas by night, as those dead bodies were left on the ground. Apart from the massacre in Aksum, the Eritrean army did kill more than 200 civilians, including elderly and priests in South Woro in a village called Mai Azmi, and the same forces massacred same 100 civilians in the south of Aksum in a village called Saglamin and further south around the irrigation areas as well. And according to eyewitnesses, during Christmas week of 2020, Eritrean troops forced 20 travelers off a minibus around Adet and killed all except one who did escape. He indicated that he observed hundreds of rape cases in Aksum Referral Hospital. He saw how his employer in Aksum University and other institutions were looted and vandalized by the Eritrean and Ethiopian soldiers, and parts of Aksum's World Heritage Site were shelled by Eritrean and Ethiopian forces, and according to him, about 23 gold, silver, and maybe even diamond coins, some of them as old as 2,000 years old, have been looted from the archaeological museum compound during the conflict. The eyewitness, who lost his father and tens of extended family members, said he's still in the deep mourning and nursing hard-to-heal trauma. He added that knowing that there are still people and places of Tigray in the hands of these mass killers pains him deeply, saying, "It pains me that the international community is not acting to save my people under the siege and double the siege as well," as he lamented. That concludes our news for today. Thank you so much for tuning in. Bye-bye.